Commander Sarah Chen stepped into the briefing room aboard the galactic cruiser Nexus Prime, her worn combat boots clicking against the polished metal floor. The assembled alien officers turned to look at her, and she could practically feel their collective disappointment radiating through the air like heat from a plasma cannon. The Zephyrian delegation sat at the far end of the conference table, their crystalline skin reflecting the overhead lights in prismatic patterns. Their leader, Admiral Kethtar, barely glanced up from his datapad when she entered. The Thurkanian representatives were even less subtle in their disdain. Their forearms crossed in perfect synchronization as they whispered among themselves in their clicking language. "Ah, the human has arrived," announced General Vexhora, the mission's overall commander. The towering Draknari's serpentine head swiveled towards Sarah, yellow eyes narrowing with barely concealed irritation. "We were beginning to wonder if your species had reconsidered their participation in this operation." Sarah took her assigned seat at the table, noting how the other chairs had been positioned to leave her slightly isolated from the main group. She'd seen this behavior before on dozens of joint operations. The galaxy's established military powers had a habit of treating humans like unwanted guests at their own funeral. "My apologies for the delay, General," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level and professional. "I was reviewing the tactical assessments one final time." A sound that might have been laughter erupted from the Thurkanian section. Commander Jeknus, his translator device rendering his words in heavily accented standard, spoke up. "Tactical assessments? How refreshing. Perhaps the human will enlighten us with her vast experience in interstellar warfare." The comment drew actual chuckles from several delegates. Sarah had heard variations of this joke countless times. Humanity had only been part of the Galactic Defense Coalition for 37 years. Barely a blink of an eye compared to the centuries or millennia of military tradition claimed by the other species. They saw humans as newcomers, inexperienced children playing at war among seasoned veterans. General Vexhora raised a clawed hand for silence. "Regardless of experience levels, we must proceed with the mission briefing. The Scorian Empire has established a forward operating base in the Kepler 442 system. Intelligence suggests they're preparing to launch strikes against our supply lines in the Outer Rim territories." The holographic display in the center of the table flickered to life, showing a three-dimensional map of the target system. The Scorian base appeared as a red dot on the fourth planet, surrounded by defensive positions and patrol routes marked in ominous crimson lines. "The plan is straightforward," Vexhora continued. "We'll execute a coordinated assault on 3 fronts. The Zephyrian fleet will engage their orbital defenses, while Thurkanian ground forces establish a beachhead on the northern continent. The Draknari will provide air support and electronic warfare capabilities." Sarah noticed the deliberate omission and waited. When no one else spoke, she cleared her throat. "And the human contingent, General?" Another pause, followed by that familiar exchange of glances between the alien commanders. Vexhora's tongue flicked out briefly, tasting the air in what Sarah had learned was a sign of mild irritation among his species. "The human forces will serve in a support capacity," he said finally. "Logistics, medical assistance, perhaps some reconnaissance work. Nothing too demanding." The dismissive tone was unmistakable. Sarah felt the familiar burning sensation in her chest that came with being underestimated, but she'd learned long ago to channel that feeling into something more productive than anger. Admiral Kethtar finally looked up from his datapad, his crystalline features refracting the light into rainbow patterns. "With respect to our human colleagues, this operation requires precision and experience. The Scorians are not known for their mercy toward prisoners, and we cannot afford to have untested forces compromising the mission." "Untested?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but something in her tone made several aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Interesting choice of words, Admiral." "Come now," Jeknus interjected, all 4 of his arms gesturing dismissively. "We mean no offense, but facts are facts. Your species has participated in what? Perhaps a dozen minor skirmishes since joining the coalition? The Scorian Empire has been our enemy for over 2 centuries. This is not a training exercise." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "You're absolutely right, Commander. My species is relatively new to galactic warfare. We've only been fighting in space for 37 years. "Precisely our point," Vexhora said, clearly pleased that the human was finally showing appropriate humility. "Of course," Sarah continued, "we've been fighting each other for roughly 6,000 years of recorded history. But I suppose that experience doesn't count for much." The room fell silent. Sarah could see several aliens exchanging uncertain glances, as if they weren't quite sure how to respond to that statement. Furthermore, she pressed on, you're correct that we've only participated in a dozen or so minor skirmishes since joining the coalition. Though I'm curious about your definition of minor, the Hegemony War lasted 18 months and involved 7-star systems. The Outer Rim Rebellion required deployment across 43 planets. The Phantom Fleet incident, well, I suppose hunting down rogue AI warships across half the galaxy, could be considered minor work. Admiral Kethtar's prismatic features had shifted to deeper blues and purples. Colors Sarah had learned indicated confusion or concern among his people. These are impressive statistics, Commander. But surely you weren't personally involved in all of these operations. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. As a matter of fact, Admiral, I was. Field command in 7 of them, support roles in the others. But please don't let my record influence your tactical decisions. I'm sure you have excellent reasons for keeping human forces in support roles. The silence stretched longer this time. General Vexhora's serpentine form had gone very still, which Sarah knew was a sign of deep thought among the Dreknari. Finally, he spoke. Commander Chen, perhaps you could provide us with a more detailed summary of your personal service record? Certainly, General. Though it might take a while. Sarah activated her personal data pad and began uploading files to the central display. Service records, commendations, after-action reports, and combat footage began scrolling across the holographic interface. The numbers were impressive enough, but it was the video recordings that really caught everyone's attention. As the assembled alien commanders watched Sarah's past missions unfold before them, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The dismissive chatter died away, replaced by an increasingly tense silence broken only by the occasional sharp intake of breath or muttered curse in various alien languages. The holographic display flickered as the first combat recording began to play. The timestamp showed a date from 8 years ago. During the height of the Hegemony War, the assembled alien commanders watched as a younger, Sarah Chen led a squad of human marines through the smoking ruins of what had once been a Hegemony stronghold on Kepler 186F. This was the Battle of Iron Ridge, Sarah explained, her voice matter-of-fact as explosions lit up the display around her past self. Hegemony forces had dug into the mountain complex with automated defense systems. Standard doctrine called for a months-long siege to starve them out. In the recording, Sarah was barking orders to her squad, while plasma bolts seared the air around them. What caught the alien observer's attention wasn't just her tactical awareness, but the way she moved. While her Marines took cover behind rocky outcroppings, Sarah was constantly in motion, darting between positions, drawing enemy fire away from her wounded soldiers. Admiral Kethtar leaned forward, his crystalline features now displaying a deep amber hue that indicated intense concentration. Commander, your tactical approach appeared unconventional. You're exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. That's what the Hegemony commanders thought too, Sarah replied. On screen, her past self had just sprinted across 50 meters of open ground under heavy fire to reach a fallen Marine. They designed their defenses to counter standard coalition doctrine. Measured advances, overwhelming firepower, minimal casualties. They weren't prepared for someone who fought like the rules were suggestions. The recording continued, showing Sarah's squad advancing through seemingly impossible terrain while under constant bombardment. But it wasn't reckless bravado driving their movements. Every dash between cover points served a purpose. Every exposed position drew enemy fire away from a more vulnerable teammate or created an opening for a flanking maneuver. Commander Zeknis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, all forearms now folded defensively across his chest. This appears to be little more than organized chaos, Commander. Where's the tactical coordination? The careful planning? Watch the enemy response patterns, Sarah suggested. Notice how their automated systems keep trying to predict our next move, based on standard military doctrine, and how we keep doing something completely different. On screen, the Hegemony defenses were indeed struggling to track the human advance. Their targeting systems would lock onto positions where standard tactics dictated the squad should be, only to find empty ground while the humans attacked from unexpected angles. What had started as a heavily fortified position was rapidly becoming a death trap for its defenders. The recording showed the final assault on the main bunker complex. Sarah's Marines moved like a pack of wolves, each soldier seeming to anticipate the other's actions without visible communication. They flowed around obstacles, regrouped without orders. and struck with surgical precision despite the apparent chaos of their approach. General Vexhora's tongue flicked out repeatedly as he watched, a sign of deep agitation among his species. How do you maintain unit cohesion without constant communication? Our sensors show minimal radio chatter during this entire engagement. Human soldiers learn to read each other, Sarah explained. Body language, positioning, micro-expressions. We've been fighting in small units for millennia. You develop an instinct for it. The first recording ended with Sarah's squad victorious, having taken a position that coalition analysts had estimated would require 3 full battalions and significant casualties. The cost: 2 wounded Marines, both of whom were shown walking out under their own power. Before anyone could comment, Sarah activated the next file. This one's from the Outer Rim Rebellion. The insurgents had taken hostages aboard a civilian transport. The new recording showed Sarah floating in zero gravity outside a massive passenger liner, leading a boarding party through what appeared to be a spacewalk from hell. Rebel fighters were using the ship's hull-mounted defensive systems against the approaching coalition forces, turning the rescue operation into a 3-dimensional maze of deadly crossfire. Standard protocol for hostage situations involves negotiation, followed by careful infiltration, Admiral Keth Tar observed, his voice now noticeably less confident than before. You appear to be conducting an assault. The rebels were executing 1 hostage every hour, Sarah replied simply. We didn't have time for standard protocol. In the recording, Sarah's team was moving across the ship's exterior with magnetic boots and grappling lines, using the vessel's own structure to shield them from defensive fire. But what truly caught the alien observers' attention was how they were manipulating the ship's rotation to create firing angles that shouldn't have been possible. You're using the artificial gravity as a weapon, breathed Commander Zheknus, genuine amazement creeping into his translated voice. The ship was spinning to generate centrifugal force for the passengers, Sarah confirmed. We simply adjusted our approach vector to use that rotation to our advantage. The rebels weren't expecting attackers who could think in 3 dimensions while dealing with constantly shifting gravitational fields. The recording showed Sarah's team cutting through the ship's hull with surgical precision, breaching multiple entry points simultaneously while the vessel continued its rotation. Inside, they moved through corridors where down became up every few seconds, engaging rebel forces who were struggling to maintain their footing in the shifting gravity fields. The aliens watched in fascination as human Marines fought in an environment that would have been disorienting for most species, treating the constantly changing orientation as if it were perfectly natural. They flowed like liquid through the ship's passages, always seeming to know which way the gravity would shift next. How do you maintain combat effectiveness in such conditions? General Vexhora demanded. The disorientation alone should render coordinated action impossible. Humans evolved on a planet with variable terrain and weather conditions, Sarah explained. We're adaptable by nature. Our ancestors hunted in forests, deserts, mountains, and ice fields. Different environments, different rules, same basic principles. The recording reached its climax as Sarah personally confronted the rebel leader in the ship's command center. The alien criminal was twice her size and armed with military-grade plasma weapons, but he made the mistake of thinking that size and firepower would be enough. Sarah fought like her ancestors had fought saber-toothed tigers, using speed, intelligence, and sheer determination to overcome a seemingly superior opponent. She turned the command center's own equipment against him, using control panels and display screens as both weapons and shields while closing the distance for hand-to-hand combat. The fight ended with the rebel leader unconscious and all hostages safely recovered. Total mission time: 43 minutes from initial breach to final extraction. As the second recording ended, the alien commanders sat in stunned silence. These weren't the actions of inexperienced newcomers to galactic warfare. This was something else entirely, something they were beginning to realize they had never encountered before. Sarah activated a third file, and Admiral Kethtar actually held up a hand to stop her. Commander, perhaps we should discuss adjusting your role in the upcoming operation. Sarah paused with her finger hovering over the next file, studying the faces around the conference table. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Where there had been dismissive arrogance just minutes before, she now saw uncertainty, curiosity, and in some cases, what might have been the beginning of respect. Actually, Admiral, she said, settling back in her chair, I think we should finish reviewing the relevant files first. You asked about my experience with the Scorian Empire specifically. Admiral Kethtar's crystalline features shifted to a pale silver, which Sarah had learned indicated surprise among his people. You've engaged Scorian forces before? The Phantom Fleet incident I mentioned earlier, Sarah confirmed, activating another recording. 3 years ago, a group of rogue Scorian commanders stole an entire battle group and declared themselves independent from both the Empire and the Coalition. They were using abandoned mining stations as bases to raid shipping lanes. The new holographic display showed the aftermath of what looked like a massive space battle. Debris from destroyed warships drifted through the void around a shattered asteroid base, while Coalition vessels moved through the wreckage like sharks through chum. I remember this incident, General Vex Hora said slowly, his serpentine form coiling with interest. The rogue fleet was eliminated, but the official reports were heavily classified. Coalition Command claimed it was a joint operation involving multiple species. It was, Sarah agreed. Sort of. My ship was supposed to provide reconnaissance support while the main fleet engaged the enemy. Standard human role at the time. Commander Jekness made a skeptical sound with his translator struggling to render it properly. So what actually happened? Sarah smiled grimly. The Scorians had studied Coalition tactics for centuries. They knew exactly how we would approach their base. They were ready for coordinated fleet actions, massed firepower, and textbook siege warfare. They weren't ready for a single human frigate to ignore every rule in the tactical manual. The recording shifted to show Sarah's ship, the UES Defiant, breaking away from the main Coalition formation and accelerating directly toward the asteroid base. What followed was 15 minutes of the most unorthodox space combat any of the alien commanders had ever witnessed. Instead of engaging the Scorian ships in open space where their superior numbers would tell, Sarah had flown her frigate directly into the asteroid field surrounding their base. She used the floating rocks as cover, weapons, and springboards, turning the entire battlefield into a three-dimensional maze where conventional tactics meant nothing. You're using the asteroids as projectiles, Admiral Kethtar observed, his voice filled with what sounded like awe. But the calculations required the precision. Humans have been throwing rocks at things for a very long time, Sarah replied. We're good at it. In the recording, the Defiant was indeed using the asteroids as weapons, but not in any way the Scorians had anticipated. Sarah's crew would accelerate small rocks to incredible velocities using their ship's gravity manipulators, then launch them at enemy vessels like kinetic missiles. But they were also using larger asteroids as shields, hiding behind them to avoid return fire while maneuvering for better positions. The Scorian commanders clearly had no idea how to respond. Their ships kept trying to engage the human frigate in conventional combat, only to find themselves pursuing shadows through a deadly obstacle course where one wrong move could mean collision with a multi-ton piece of space debris. This is impossible, Commander Jekness muttered, all four of his arms gesturing at the display in disbelief. The stress on your ship's hull alone should have torn you apart. No vessel can maneuver like that in an asteroid field. Most vessels can't, Sarah agreed. Human ships are built differently. We designed them to survive Earth's variable gravity, extreme weather, and tectonic activity. They're more flexible than standard Coalition designs. The recording showed the Defiant pulling maneuvers that would have been suicide for any other ship. It twisted through gaps barely wider than its hull, used asteroid gravity wells to slingshot around obstacles, and at one point actually bounced off a large rock to change direction in a way that violated several known laws of physics. But it wasn't just reckless flying that was winning the battle. Sarah's crew was systematically dismantling the Scorian formation by forcing them to fight on human terms. Every engagement drew the enemy ships deeper into the asteroid field, where their superior firepower meant nothing if they couldn't get a clear shot. Watch this part carefully, Sarah said as the recording approached its climax. This is where we learned something important about Scorian psychology. On screen, the Defiant had just destroyed 2 enemy cruisers by causing them to collide with each other while pursuing the human ship through a particularly dense section of the asteroid field. The remaining Scorian vessels were regrouping, their commanders clearly trying to decide whether to continue the pursuit or retreat to open space. Sarah's ship suddenly stopped all evasive maneuvers and hung motionless in space, apparently helpless between 2 large asteroids. The Scorian ships immediately converged on what appeared to be an easy target. You're using yourself as bait, General Vex Hora realized, his tongue flicking out in agitation. But why? Your ship appears to be trapped. Scorians are predators by evolution, Sarah explained. When they see weakness, their instinct is to attack immediately and overwhelming. We were counting on that. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. As the Scorian ships closed in for what they thought would be an easy kill, Sarah's crew triggered pre-positioned charges on the surrounding asteroids. Instead of destroying the rocks, the explosion sent them tumbling toward the converging enemy ships in a carefully calculated pattern. The Scorians found themselves caught in a closing net of massive space debris. With no room to maneuver and no clear escape route, their ships were designed for open space combat, not for threading through a constantly shifting maze of obstacles. Within minutes, the entire remaining force had been eliminated without the Defiant firing a single conventional weapon. Incredible, Admiral Kethtar whispered, his features now displaying a deep gold that indicated profound respect. You eliminated an entire battle group with essentially no damage to your own vessel. The important thing, Sarah continued, is what we learned about Scorian tactical doctrine. They're excellent soldiers, but they think in very linear terms. They see combat as a problem to be solved through superior force and careful planning. They don't adapt well to chaos. She gestured to the tactical display showing the current mission parameters. Your plan for the assault on their base is textbook coalition doctrine. Coordinated advances, overwhelming firepower, minimal casualties. Exactly what they'll be expecting. Commander Jekness had gone very quiet, his forearms now folded thoughtfully rather than defensively. What would you suggest instead, Commander? Sarah stood up and walked to the holographic display, her fingers dancing over the control interface as she began modifying the tactical plan. We give them what they're not expecting: chaos, confusion, and a complete disregard for conventional wisdom. As she worked, the carefully organized assault plan began to transform into something that looked more like organized madness. Instead of coordinated strikes on predetermined targets, Sarah was plotting seemingly random attacks across multiple vectors. Instead of massed formations, she was breaking the assault force into small, independent units that would strike without apparent coordination. This looks like you're abandoning all tactical coherence, General Vexhora observed, though his tone was now more curious than critical. From the Scorian perspective, yes, Sarah agreed. But there's a pattern here, just not one they'll recognize. Every one of these random strikes serves a specific purpose in weakening their overall defense structure. She highlighted several key positions on the enemy base. These attacks will force them to redeploy their reserves to defend what they think are priority targets. These strikes will disrupt their communication networks without appearing to be coordinated, and this final assault will come from a direction they'll never expect, because no sane military commander would ever attempt it. The alien commanders studied the revised plan, and Sarah could see understanding beginning to dawn in their expressions. What had seemed like chaos was actually a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, designed to exploit every known weakness in Scorian psychology and tactics. The Nexus Prime's bridge hummed with nervous energy as the combined fleet approached the Kepler 442 system. Sarah stood at her assigned tactical station, watching the alien crew members around her with interest. The change in their behavior since the briefing had been remarkable. Admiral Kethtar, who had barely acknowledged her presence before, now sought her opinion on every major tactical decision. The Zephyrian commander had even gone so far as to request copies of human combat manuals, though Sarah suspected the crystalline alien would find human doctrine more confusing than enlightening. Approaching the system perimeter, announced the navigation officer, a young Thurcanian whose translator rendered his nervousness in stuttering bursts. Scorian patrol ships detected on standard intercept courses. General Vexhora's massive form dominated the command chair, but Sarah noticed that his attention kept drifting to her station. Commander Chen, your assessment of their patrol patterns? Sarah studied the tactical display, noting the precise formation of the Scorian vessels. They're running a textbook defensive screen, 3-layer perimeter, overlapping sensor coverage, automated response protocols. Very professional, very predictable. Predictable is good for us, yes? Asked Commander Jekness from his position at the engineering console. Usually, Sarah agreed, but in this case, it tells us something important. They're confident in their position. Too confident. They think they know exactly what we're going to do. The first phase of the assault began exactly as planned in the revised tactical doctrine. The Zephyrian fleet moved toward the system's outer planet, their crystalline ships gleaming like jewels against the star field. To any observer, it appeared to be a standard diversionary attack, designed to draw attention away from the real assault. The Scorians responded exactly as predicted. Their patrol ships moved to intercept the Zephyrian force, while their orbital platforms began charging weapons for a long-range bombardment. It was a perfectly executed defensive maneuver that would have been devastatingly effective against conventional coalition tactics. Second wave. Initiate approach Vector 77 Alpha, Vex Hora commanded. The Thurcanian assault ships emerged from behind the system's largest moon, their dark hulls almost invisible against the void. This too was according to standard doctrine, a flanking maneuver designed to catch the enemy between two forces while they were focused on the diversionary attack. Again, the Scorians adapted flawlessly. Reserve squadrons moved to intercept the new threat, while maintaining their defensive positions around the primary targets. Their response was so precise it seemed almost mechanical, each ship moving to predetermined positions with mathematical accuracy. Sarah watched the enemy movements with growing satisfaction. "They're committing to their defensive plan," she observed. "All reserves are now deployed." Beginning final approach, Admiral Kethtar announced from his command ship. The main coalition fleet was now moving toward the fourth planet where the Scorian base was located, their formation perfect examples of combined arms doctrine. But as the three-pronged assault developed, something unexpected happened. The human ships, which had been maintaining their assigned support positions throughout the engagement, suddenly began to scatter. "What are the humans doing?" demanded a Thurcanian officer, his translator making his confusion clear. "They're breaking formation." On the tactical display, the human vessels were indeed abandoning their assigned positions, but not randomly. To trained eyes, their movements had purpose, even if that purpose wasn't immediately clear to observers thinking in conventional terms. Sarah's own ship, the Defiant, led a small group of human vessels on what appeared to be a suicidal charge directly toward the heaviest concentration of Scorian defenses. Other human ships were spreading throughout the system, some heading for seemingly empty space while others accelerated toward asteroid fields or the system's inner planets. "This was not in the tactical plan," General Vex Hora said, his voice tight with concern. "Commander Chen, explain your ship's actions." "We're implementing Phase 4, Sarah replied calmly. Though Phase 4 didn't exist in any of the official planning documents, the Scorian response to the human ship's behavior was immediate and predictable. Seeing what appeared to be a breakdown in coalition coordination, they pressed their advantage. Additional squadrons moved to exploit what looked like gaps in the fleet formation, while their heaviest guns targeted the apparently out-of-position human vessels. It was exactly the wrong response. The human ships that had seemed to be fleeing toward empty space suddenly reversed course, having used the gravity wells of distant planets to slingshot back toward the enemy at tremendous velocities. The vessels that had entered asteroid fields emerged with massive chunks of rock attached to their hulls, turning themselves into kinetic weapons of devastating potential. Sarah's own group, which had appeared to be making a doomed frontal assault, suddenly split apart like a breaking wave. Each ship took a different approach to the target, some diving below the planetary defense grid while others used the planet's upper atmosphere to mask their approach. "Impossible," breathed Admiral Kethtar. "How are they coordinating without communication? Our sensors show no tactical data being transmitted between their ships." "Human crews don't need constant communication," Sarah explained, her fingers dancing over her tactical controls as she coordinated with ships that were supposedly operating independently. "We planned this before we left the fleet. Every captain knows their role, their timing, and their fallback positions." The Scorian defense network, which had been perfectly organized just minutes before, was now in complete chaos. Their ships were scattered across the system, trying to respond to threats that kept appearing in impossible locations. Their defensive formations had been optimized for conventional attacks, not for enemies who treated the laws of physics as suggestions and military doctrine as rough guidelines. "The base is launching additional fighters," reported the tactical officer. Sarah nodded, watching the new wave of enemy craft emerge from the planetary surface. "Right on schedule. Signal all human vessels. Implement scatter pattern delta. What followed was 15 minutes of the most unconventional space combat the alien commanders had ever witnessed. Human ships fought like a pack of wolves, appearing and disappearing throughout the system, striking at vulnerable targets before vanishing back into the cosmic maze they had created. The Defiant herself engaged 3 Scorian cruisers simultaneously, using a combination of asteroid cover and gravitational slingshots to stay ahead of their targeting systems. Sarah's crew fought their ship like it was an extension of their own bodies, every maneuver flowing seamlessly into the next. They're using the planet's magnetic field as a weapon. Commander Zeknis observed in amazement as one human ship discharged built-up electromagnetic energy to disable an entire squadron of enemy fighters. And the solar wind, added Admiral Kethtar, watching another human vessel surf a stream of charged particles to accelerate beyond anything its engines should have been capable of producing. But perhaps most impressive was the way the human ships coordinated their seemingly chaotic attacks. Without apparent communication, they supported each other's maneuvers, created openings for their allies, and covered retreats with perfect timing. It was as if they were reading each other's minds across vast distances. The end came suddenly. The Scorian base, which had seemed impregnable just an hour before, was now isolated and vulnerable. Their defensive fleets were scattered across the system. Their orbital platforms had been systematically eliminated, and their ground-based defenses were facing attacks from directions their designers had never considered possible. Base Commander is requesting terms, announced the communication officer, her voice filled with disbelief. General Vex Hora stared at the tactical display for a long moment before turning to Sarah. Commander, in 37 years of military service, I have never witnessed anything like what your species just accomplished. Sarah nodded acknowledgement but kept her attention on the tactical situation. The base hasn't surrendered yet, General. They're buying time while they destroy sensitive materials. I recommend we accept their surrender immediately and begin landing operations. As the alien commanders began coordinating the occupation of the captured Scorian base, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The mission had been a complete success, accomplished with minimal casualties and in a fraction of the time originally estimated. The Scorian base sprawled across the barren landscape of Kepler 442 like a metallic cancer, its defensive towers and bunker complexes carved directly into the rocky terrain. Sarah stood in the forward observation post, studying the enemy fortifications through high-powered optics while the alien commanders argued about the best approach for the ground assault. The defensive positions are too well entrenched, General Vex Hora was saying, his serpentine form coiled with frustration. A direct assault would cost us thousands of casualties even with orbital support. Admiral Kethtar's crystalline features had shifted to a pale blue that indicated deep concern. Perhaps a siege would be more prudent. We could isolate the base and wait for them to surrender. The Scorians don't surrender, Commander Zeknis interjected, all 4 of his arms gesturing emphatically. They'll fight to the last soldier and destroy everything of value before we can capture it. Sarah continued studying the base layout, noting the careful placement of automated defense turrets, the overlapping fields of fire, and the multiple layers of physical barriers. It was a fortress designed by military engineers who understood coalition tactics perfectly. Too perfectly, in fact. Commander Chen, General Vex Hora called. What is your assessment of the ground situation? Sarah lowered her optics and turned to face the assembled commanders. The base is a trap, she said simply. The statement caused immediate consternation among the alien officers. Admiral Kethtar's features shifted to a deep amber that indicated confusion. Explain, please. Look at the defensive layout, Sarah said, activating the holographic tactical display. Every position is perfectly placed to counter standard coalition ground assault doctrine. The approach routes, the fire lanes, the backup positions, it's all designed to funnel our forces into predetermined kill zones. Commander Zeknis studied the display with growing understanding. You believe they've been planning this engagement for some time? I believe they've been planning for this type of engagement for decades, Sarah corrected. They know exactly how coalition forces will approach this problem, and they've built their defenses accordingly. General Vex Hora's tongue flicked out repeatedly, a sign of agitation. Then how do you propose we proceed? We cannot simply ignore the base, Sarah smiled grimly. We don't ignore it. We just don't attack it the way they expect. She began modifying the tactical display, highlighting terrain features that the alien commanders had largely overlooked. Deep ravines cut through the landscape around the base, while ancient lava tubes created a network of natural tunnels beneath the surface. The Scorians have prepared for armored assaults, airstrikes, and siege warfare, Sarah explained. They haven't prepared for ghosts. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a plan that made the alien commanders increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of massed formations and overwhelming firepower, she proposed infiltrating the base using small teams of human soldiers who would move through the underground tunnel network. "This is madness," Admiral Kethtar protested. "The tunnels could collapse at any moment. And even if your soldiers reach the base, how do they fight their way through fortified positions designed to stop entire battalions?" "They don't fight through them," Sarah replied. "They go around them." The human assault began at dawn, but it bore no resemblance to any ground operation the alien observers had ever witnessed. Instead of advancing across open ground toward the enemy fortifications, the human soldiers simply vanished into the landscape. Sarah led the primary infiltration team herself, guiding her Marines through the labyrinthine network of lava tubes beneath the planet's surface. The tunnels were pitch black, barely wide enough for a human to crawl through, and filled with toxic gases that would have been lethal to most species. But humans had evolved in caves. They were comfortable in enclosed spaces, adapted to navigate by touch and sound when visual cues were unavailable. The Scorians, who had evolved on a planet with vast open plains, found such environments deeply disturbing. "Alpha Team, report," came Admiral Kethtar's voice through Sarah's comm system. 2 kilometers from primary target," Sarah whispered back, her voice barely audible over the communication link. "No contact with enemy forces." Above ground, the Scorian defenders were beginning to show signs of confusion. Their sensors detected the Coalition fleet in orbit and the main ground forces in their assembly areas. But the expected assault had never materialized. Automated defense systems swept empty terrain while garrison commanders waited for an attack that wasn't coming. Sarah's team emerged from the tunnel network directly beneath the base's central command complex. The Scorians had built their fortifications to repel attacks from the outside, not to prevent infiltrators from emerging in the middle of their most secure areas. "Breaching charges set," reported Sergeant Martinez, Sarah's demolitions expert. "Ready to proceed on your signal." "Wait for the fireworks," Sarah replied, checking her chronometer. 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes stretched like hours as Sarah's team waited in the darkness beneath the enemy command center. Above them, hundreds of Scorian soldiers continued their vigilant watch for an assault that would never come from the direction they expected. The explosion, when it came, was not what the enemy anticipated. Instead of a massive detonation that would collapse the entire complex, Sarah's team used precisely placed charges to create controlled openings in the floor of the command center. Suddenly, human soldiers were emerging from beneath the Scorians' feet like deadly flowers blooming from the ground. The enemy response was immediate, but poorly coordinated. Scorian soldiers were trained for conventional warfare, not for close-quarters combat in confined spaces against opponents who seemed to materialize from thin air. The human Marines moved through the complex like wraiths, using the base's own structure as cover and concealment. "Bravo team in position," came another voice over the comm. Sarah's Marines weren't the only humans who had infiltrated the base. Teams were emerging throughout the complex, striking at key infrastructure targets while avoiding direct confrontation with the main garrison. Within minutes, the Scorian base was paralyzed. Power systems failed as human demolition experts severed critical connections. Communication networks went dark as fiber optic cables were cut with surgical precision. Automated defense systems turned on each other as their control systems were compromised by human hackers who had gained physical access to secure terminals. "This is impossible," came General Vex Hora's voice over the comm. "How are you maintaining coordination in such a complex environment?" "Practice," Sarah replied tersely, her team now fighting their way toward the base's main reactor complex. Humans have been fighting in urban environments for thousands of years. Buildings, tunnels, sewers, it's all the same basic principle. The beauty of the human assault was its complete unpredictability. Where Scorian defenders expected massed attacks, they found individual soldiers. Where they looked for coordinated advances, they discovered apparent chaos that somehow produced devastating results. Every defensive position had been designed to counter specific coalition tactics, and none of those tactics were being employed. Sarah's team reached the reactor complex to find it heavily defended by the base's elite guard units. But instead of attempting to fight through the defenders, she led her Marines through the facility's maintenance tunnels, emerging in the reactor chamber itself while the guards continued watching the main entrances. "Reactor secured," Sarah reported, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what her team had just accomplished. Beginning shutdown procedures, the Skorian base commander, a grizzled veteran named Korthak, who had fought coalition forces for over 20 years, found himself in the impossible position of commanding a fortress that was being systematically dismantled from within by enemies who refused to fight according to any doctrine he understood. His final transmission to the orbital Skorian fleet was both an admission of defeat and a warning: unknown human tactics. Conventional defenses ineffective. Base compromised. Do not underestimate the human forces. As the base's defenses finally collapsed and Skorian forces began surrendering in organized groups, the alien commanders of the coalition fleet could only watch in amazement. The fortress that should have taken weeks to reduce had fallen in less than 6 hours, with minimal casualties on either side. "Commander Chen," Admiral Kethtar's voice came over the communication system. "Please report to the command ship for debriefing. Command is very interested in your tactical innovations." Sarah smiled as she watched Skorian soldiers file out of their positions with their hands raised. "Acknowledged, Admiral. Sending full tactical reports now." But even as she prepared her official reports, Sarah knew that the real lesson of this engagement would be lost on most of the coalition's leadership. They would study her tactics, try to codify them into doctrine, and completely miss the point that human military effectiveness came not from following rules, but from the willingness to ignore them when the situation demanded it. 3 weeks after the fall of the Skorian base, Sarah found herself standing before the Galactic Defense Coalition's highest military tribunal. The massive chamber aboard the orbital station Concordia Prime housed representatives from every major military power in the galaxy, their varied forms creating a rainbow of alien physiology and technology. Admiral Kethtar had testified first, his crystalline features displaying the deep gold of profound respect as he described the human tactical innovations. General Vexhora followed, his serpentine form coiled with what Sarah had learned to recognize as genuine enthusiasm as he detailed the strategic implications of human military doctrine. But it was Commander Zeknis who surprised everyone with the depth of his analysis. The four-armed Thurkanian had spent the past 3 weeks studying every aspect of human military history he could access, and his testimony read like a revelation rather than a routine after-action report. "Honorable Tribunal," Zeknis had concluded, "we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human military capability. We have been treating them as inexperienced newcomers when they are, in fact, the most experienced warriors in the galaxy." Now it was Sarah's turn to address the tribunal, and she could feel the weight of countless alien eyes focused on her as she stepped up to the speaker's podium. The chamber fell silent except for the subtle background hum of life support systems and universal translators. "Commander Chen," began Supreme Admiral Korthtai, the tribunal's presiding officer, "your recent actions have generated considerable discussion within Coalition Command. Some call your methods innovative. Others consider them dangerous departures from established doctrine. We would hear your perspective." Sarah had prepared for this moment, knowing that her words could determine humanity's future role in galactic affairs. "Supreme Admiral, with respect, I believe the discussion misses the fundamental point. We haven't departed from doctrine. We've demonstrated that effective doctrine must be flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances." A ripple of commentary swept through the chamber before Korthtai called for order. "Explain this distinction, Commander." "Every species in this chamber has developed military doctrine based on their own evolutionary history and environmental pressures," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "The Zephyrians excel at coordination because their ancestors survived by working in perfect harmony with crystalline networks. The Draknari are masters of strategic planning because their predatory evolution required long-term thinking. The Thurkanians are exceptional engineers because they had to build complex structures to survive on their hostile homeworld." She paused, studying the faces around her. But Earth was different. Earth was chaos. The universal translators struggled briefly with the concept before settling on approximations that conveyed the meaning across multiple alien languages. Sarah continued before anyone could interrupt. My species didn't evolve in a stable environment that rewarded single strategies. We survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, floods, droughts, and countless other disasters. We learned to hunt mammoth in the Arctic, lions on the savanna, and sharks in the ocean. We built civilizations in deserts, jungles, mountains, and islands. We adapted because adaptation was the only alternative to extinction. Admiral Kethtar leaned forward, his features now displaying a deep blue that indicated intense interest. You're suggesting that human military doctrine is inherently adaptive rather than prescriptive? I'm suggesting that human survival has always depended on the ability to recognize when the rules no longer apply, Sarah replied. Every other species developed within relatively stable environmental parameters. You created military doctrines that reflected those stable conditions, but stability is an illusion. Conditions change, enemies adapt, and rigid doctrine becomes a weakness rather than a strength. Supreme Admiral Korethai's own species, the ancient Kelrathi, had dominated galactic politics for over a millennium through careful planning and overwhelming resources. His response carried the weight of that tradition. You propose that we abandon thousands of years of proven military science in favor of chaos. Not chaos, Supreme Admiral. Controlled adaptation. Sarah activated the holographic display at the podium showing a complex three-dimensional model. This is the theoretical framework underlying human military thinking. Every tactical situation exists within a dynamic system of variables. Terrain, enemy capabilities, available resources, time constraints, political considerations, and dozens of other factors. The model shifted and flowed as she spoke, demonstrating how each variable influenced the others in an intricate dance of cause and effect. Traditional coalition doctrine attempts to impose order on this system by establishing fixed responses to predicted scenarios. It works well when the predictions are accurate, but fails catastrophically when faced with unexpected variables. She manipulated the display to show how rigid tactical responses would perform against various changing conditions. Human doctrine acknowledges that the system is inherently unpredictable. Instead of trying to control it, we learn to surf it. Commander Jeknes made an excited gesture with all four arms. This explains the coordination we observed during the assault. Your ships weren't following predetermined flight paths. They were continuously adapting to the changing tactical environment. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. Human crews train extensively in pattern recognition and adaptive response. We learn to read the flow of battle and adjust our actions accordingly. It looks like chaos to observers thinking in linear terms, but it's actually a very sophisticated form of order. A new voice joined the discussion from the hegemony section of the chamber. Commander Chen, this is a fascinating theory, but theory means nothing without practical application. How do you propose to integrate these concepts into existing coalition doctrine? Sarah had been dreading this question because she knew her answer would be controversial. With respect, I don't think you can integrate these concepts into existing doctrine. Adaptive tactics can't be taught through traditional military education because they require fundamental changes in how officers think about warfare. The chamber erupted in discussion as the implications of her statement sank in. Supreme Admiral Korethai called for order multiple times before the noise subsided enough for him to speak. You're suggesting that coalition military training is fundamentally flawed? I'm suggesting that coalition military training is optimized for a different type of warfare than what we actually face, Sarah replied carefully. Your academies teach officers to analyze threats, develop plans, and execute those plans with precision. That approach works well against predictable enemies using familiar tactics. She gestured to the holographic display, which now showed battle formations from a dozen different species. But look at what we've learned about our real enemies. The Scorian Empire has been studying coalition doctrine for centuries. They know exactly how we fight, and they've developed counters for every standard tactical approach. Traditional training actually makes our forces more predictable, not more effective. Admiral Kethtar's features had shifted to a pale silver that indicated deep thought. What alternative do you propose? Cross-training with human forces, Sarah said simply. Not to learn human tactics specifically, but to learn how to think like humans. How to recognize when doctrine is becoming a liability instead of an asset. How to adapt in real time to changing circumstances. The proposal sent another wave of discussion through the chamber. The idea of alien military officers training with humans was unprecedented, and many of the tribunal members were clearly uncomfortable with the implications. But General Vexahora rose from his position, his massive form commanding attention throughout the chamber. "Supreme Admiral, I request permission to volunteer the 3rd Draknari Battle Group for an experimental training program with human forces." The Thurkanian delegation quickly followed suit, with Commander Jeknus offering an entire engineering battalion for joint exercises. Within minutes, representatives from 6 different species had volunteered their forces for what was essentially an admission that their traditional training methods might be inadequate. Supreme Admiral Korethtai called for a recess while the tribunal considered the proposals, but Sarah could see in the faces around her that something fundamental had changed. The galaxy's military establishment was beginning to recognize that human warfare wasn't just different. It might be better adapted to the realities of modern conflict. 2 years later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Coalition Training Station Harmony, watching the most diverse military exercise in galactic history unfold in the space around her. Ships from 16 different species moved through complex maneuvers that would have been impossible under traditional doctrine, their crews working together with a fluidity that still amazed veteran observers. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first joint training exercises had been disasters, with alien crews struggling to adapt to human tactical thinking, while human officers learned to work with species whose thought processes operated on completely different principles. But gradually, something remarkable had emerged from the chaos. "Simulation complete," announced Lieutenant Morrison from the Exercise Control Center. "All objectives achieved with 92% efficiency and minimal casualties." Sarah nodded, watching as the mixed fleets began their return to base formation. The maneuvers they had just completed would have taken pure coalition forces 3 times as long to accomplish, with significantly higher risk factors. More importantly, they had successfully countered every tactical scenario based on known enemy doctrine. Commander Chen called Admiral Kethtar as he approached the observation window. The Zephyrian's features displayed the warm gold that indicated satisfaction and achievement. "The tribunal's final assessment is complete." Sarah turned to face him, noting the mix of alien officers gathered behind the admiral. General Vexahora coiled beside Commander Jeknus, while representatives from 6 other species formed an informal circle around them. These were the officers who had volunteered for the first experimental training programs, and they had become the core advocates for the new integrated doctrine. "Supreme Admiral Korethtai has asked me to inform you that the Coalition High Command has voted to officially adopt Adaptive Response Doctrine as the new standard for all military operations," Kethtar continued. "Furthermore, the Human Military Advisory Corps is being established as a permanent institution, with you as its first director." The announcement should have felt like a victory, but Sarah found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this point. The skepticism, the resistance, the countless hours spent proving that human methods weren't just luck or reckless bravado, but represented a fundamentally different approach to military science. "There's more," General Vexahora added, his serpentine form displaying what Sarah had learned to recognize as amusement. "Intelligence reports indicate that the Scorian Empire is completely restructuring their military doctrine. Apparently they've realized that their existing defensive strategies are useless against forces that refuse to fight according to predicted patterns." Commander Jeknus gestured with all 4 arms toward the returning fleet. "The ripple effects extend beyond military applications. The engineering corps has adopted human problem-solving methodologies, and we're seeing innovation rates increase by over 300%. It seems that adaptive thinking produces benefits far beyond combat effectiveness." Sarah watched a formation of mixed ships execute a maneuver that would have been considered impossible just 2 years ago. A Zephyrian cruiser, 2 Thurkanian destroyers, and a human frigate moved together like parts of a single organism, each crew anticipating the other's actions without constant communication. They had learned to fight like humans, but more than that, they had learned to think like humans. "The most interesting development," Kethtar added, "is that several species are requesting permission to establish permanent exchange programs with human colonies. They want their young officers to experience the environmental pressures that shaped human adaptive capabilities." That brought a smile to Sarah's face. The idea of alien cadets learning to survive in Earth's chaotic environment was both amusing and appropriate. If they truly wanted to understand human tactical thinking, they needed to experience the conditions that had created it. "There is one concern," General Vexhora said, his tone becoming more serious. "Some tribunal members worry that widespread adoption of adaptive doctrine could lead to a loss of military discipline and order. They fear that encouraging creative thinking might undermine command authority." Sarah had anticipated this concern and had spent considerable time developing her response. "General, discipline and creativity aren't mutually exclusive. Human military forces maintain strict command structures while still encouraging tactical innovation. The key is understanding the difference between strategic objectives and tactical methods." She gestured toward the observation window, where the exercise fleets were now docking with the station. Those crews followed their orders precisely. They achieved every objective assigned to them. But they were free to determine how to achieve those objectives based on real-time conditions, rather than predetermined plans. "The Academy is requesting a complete revision of the tactical curriculum," Commander Jekness added. "They want human instructors to teach courses in adaptive thinking and environmental assessment. Some of the older faculty members are resistant to these changes." "Change is never easy," Sarah acknowledged. "But the alternative is stagnation. The galaxy is a dangerous place and our enemies are constantly evolving. Static doctrine is a luxury we can't afford." As if summoned by her words, Lieutenant Morrison's voice came over the station's communication system. "Commander Chen, priority message from Coalition Intelligence. New Scorian activity detected in the Rigel sector. They appear to be testing modified tactical doctrines." Sarah exchanged glances with the alien officers around her. This was the real test of everything they had built together. The Scorians had been studying the Coalition's new capabilities, just as intensively as the Coalition had once studied theirs. Now they would see whether adaptive doctrine could counter adaptive enemies. "Signal the fleet commanders," she ordered. "We're implementing operational protocols immediately." This is not a drill. As alarms began sounding throughout the station and crews rushed to battle stations, Sarah felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came before combat. But this time was different. She wasn't facing the enemy alone or with reluctant alien allies who saw humans as inexperienced newcomers. This time she was part of something larger, a truly integrated force that combined the best capabilities of every species in the Coalition. The observation deck began to clear as officers hurried to their ships, but Admiral Kethtar paused beside Sarah before leaving. "Commander, 2 years ago you told us that humans had been preparing for galactic warfare for 6,000 years. I'm beginning to understand what you meant." Sarah nodded, watching as the station's massive docking bays opened to release the assembled fleet. "We didn't prepare for galactic warfare specifically, Admiral. We prepared for survival in an unpredictable universe. It turns out that's the same thing." As the mixed Coalition fleet accelerated toward the Rigel sector, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first briefing. Aboard the Nexus Prime, the alien commanders who had once dismissed humanity as inexperienced newcomers were now eager students of human military philosophy. The rigid doctrines that had dominated galactic warfare for millennia were giving way to flexible, adaptive strategies that could counter any enemy. But perhaps most importantly, the galaxy's military forces were learning to work together as a truly unified entity, rather than a collection of separate species pursuing their own agendas. They had become something new, something that no single enemy could predict or counter, because they themselves were constantly evolving. The Scorians and their allies were about to discover that the galaxy had learned to fight like humans, and that Sarah knew would change everything.